got plenty and then some. What do I do? I got plenty and then some. What do I do? I got plenty and then some. What do I do? Go out and help somebody. Get plenty and then some too. I got a roof over my head. What shall I do? Come on, everybody. I got a roof over my head. What shall I do? Got a roof over my head. What shall I do? I'm going out and help somebody. Get a roof over their head too. I got supper on the table. What shall I do? I got supper on the table. What shall I do? I got supper on the table. What shall I do? I'm going to help somebody. Get supper on the table too. I'm going to heaven. What shall I do? I'm going to heaven. What shall I do? I'm going to heaven. What shall I do? Go out and help somebody. Go to heaven too. I got plenty and then some. What shall I do? I got plenty and then some. What shall I do? I got plenty and then some. What shall I do? Go out and help somebody. Get plenty and then some too.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to get to welcome our speaker this morning, a man who needs no introduction to this community, but a man who has brought all of you into this space to celebrate, to listen, to learn, to worship, to be together, because we know that the attacks that are happening against this man are attacks that are happening against this community, and that we will stand by him, and that we will stand by each other. And so it is a blessing to get to welcome Chuck Turner to come and speak with us.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to, definitely good to be here with you. Let me step out kind of from behind the lectern and let me ask some kind of logistical questions. How much?
Probably 25 minutes.
All right. And what questions after? Okay. Does anybody have a watch or a clock? So I can just kind of. Here we are.
11:45.
Okay, yeah, can somebody just let me know when it's maybe 15 minutes, around 12, when it's around 12 o'clock? Let me Then we can see where we go from there. Well, I really appreciate all of your being here today, and wanted just to share my reflections on the situation that I'm facing, the situation that we're facing in general, and kind of the intersection between my arrest and conviction and the general issues of prosecutorial terrorism in the country, as the person who wrote the books, Harvey, wrote a book on a Silverglate. Harvey Silverglate has written a book called 3 Felonies a Day that everyone should read, because what he really helps to do is to expand our consciousness of the problem relating to prosecutors not having any limitations on their power, and tries to argue, I think argues well, that the reality is that this prosecutorial terrorism isn't just focused on people who are immigrants, isn't focused just on those who are Muslims, isn't focused just on those who are black elected officials or Latino elected officials. It's in fact a rampant terrorism that is focused at whomever the prosecutors choose to target. Ironically, my wife was saying that Tom DeLay, a notorious congressional person accused of many crimes that I certainly believe he committed. But the interesting thing is he argued, I guess after his conviction, was talking about the issue of the prosecutorial power and how it operates. And I think it's worth looking in his perspective as well as Silverglate's, because to me, for those of us who are struggling around change in this country, this whole experience has helped me appreciate that while we ignore the question of injustice, my perspective on my own work and the work of others that I've worked with is that we haven't really looked strategically and deeply at the question of the judicial system and how it operates, and more importantly, how we can begin to take it apart. Because the reality, reality is that if we're really talking about transforming the country, a country that has been founded on the concept of injustice and has developed over time mechanisms to protect that injustice, then if we're talking about transformation, not just issues, not just talking about housing or jobs or health care, and the distribution of those resources, but talking fundamentally about justice and how justice is achieved. Because as you think about the issues that we deal with, those issues are always focused on the question of what is just, what is the just distribution of these resources, what is the just decision-making power, what is fair based on the principle that we all in this so-called democratic society have a right, but we also have a responsibility to structure our interactions with each other in a way that is just. But again, we tend to focus on the issues and have allowed the judicial system to run rampant. And let me just lay that out as a framework, and then pull back a little bit about and talk about my situation, and then come forward and talk about what I think we need to do here in this city, in this state, and around this country to dismantle the injustice system, to dismantle brick by brick the injustice system. And I think we have the capacity over time to do that work, and I think if we don't do that work, we're fooling ourselves in terms of our issue-oriented work, because we talk a lot about the military-industrial complex and how the reality is that if we don't begin to focus on this conjunction of power that is designed to keep the present system in place, that focusing on wars is just like dealing with the symptom of a cold or the symptom of a disease, but not getting to the roots. You know, similarly, I think we need to begin to recognize that if we're serious about achieving justice in this country, then we have to be serious about having a justice system that's focused on providing justice to everyone rather than maintaining the system in the interest of the oligarchy. If, in terms of the, if we really want to understand that perspective and appreciate the perspective that I have and that many of us in this room undoubtedly have, that we are at war. See, it's not just an issue for me, it's not just an issue of issues, but it's an issue of a fundamental clash between ideas. Fundamental clash between ideas. Between the idea that became dominant in this country, that a small group of people have the right to determine and control the lives of others based on who they are. That's the fundamental, I believe, the fundamental driving idea of this country that's been embodied in law by the Constitution. That is, that people talk about the Constitution. Let's be real. The Constitution was a document developed in order to put in place a legal economic system that allowed the oligarchy to maintain its control. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time getting into that, but we have to, if we're really going to talk about cleansing the American body politic, if we're really going to talk about beginning to consciously work toward the achievement of justice in this country, and there can't be justice in the world if there isn't justice in this country, given the inordinate influence. And so if we're really serious about justice in the world, then we have to be serious about our analysis of the situation that we're part of and how the injustice system works and how we begin to systematically structure and stage a process of change that we believe can be effective. But to go back to the question of give us some perspective, Chuck, on what you're really saying. You know, most of us think about the Revolutionary War ending in 1781. There was a sign on the side of a road out in western Mass, outside a town called South Egremont, Massachusetts, just down the road from Great Barrington. Little sign. I think it's still there. I haven't seen it for a few years. It says, "The last battle of the Revolutionary War was fought here." Ooh, fascinating. The last battle of the Revolutionary War was not fought in Virginia. It was fought just outside of Great Barrington, Mass. That wasn't put in my history books. And so I got outside. I got out of the car when I saw this sign caught my eye, and looked at it, and it had a date, April 1786. 5 years after, the history books said that the Revolutionary War ended. So this said 1786. And the rest of the sign said that this was the spot where Colonel Daniel Shea and his militia were massacred, killed by the Boston militia that had been organized by Sam Adams to march to Western Mass to put down the insurrection. The insurrection was based on the idea that these farmers in Western Mass had that that the Revolutionary War was about them and their rights. When they got back to their farms, they saw that the bankers and the government were operating together to take their land. Can you imagine that? They just had fought the war for freedom, and they go back home, and what do they see? Our land has been taken, is being taken by these people. And what do? They do what any right-thinking human beings who had just fought a war in order to establish their, quote, freedom from England. They said, let's go to the capital. And that's where they were gunned down as they were preparing to march on Boston. If you think about the date, April 1786, interesting year. Why? Because the Constitution was written in 1786. In fact, and later, it didn't. The Constitutional Convention was not called until Shea and his troops were killed. Because as I read history, it sent a shockwave through the quote founding fathers. It sent a shockwave because the governmental system at that time was one of a confederation. Some would argue that it was structured on the basis of the Iroquois Federation. That is, that in North America, about I think 100 years before the Revolutionary War, the Iroquois Indians had developed peace treaties with tribes across the northern plains into this area, and in order to have peace, so they could have prosperity. And some argue that the initial documents around the Confederation that came out of the Revolutionary War were based on the conceptual and practical framework of the Iroquois Federation. The Constitutional Convention, though, the people who saw the Revolutionary War as a means to solidify their economic power and independence from England, and now saw that others were looking at the question of how they could share in that power. They said basically we need a central government. We need to protect this fragile democracy. And so they, from some of our perspectives, broke the agreement in terms of the Articles of Confederation and established a constitutional government. We can understand that the constitutional government had nothing to do with justice. You know, when you hear these people talk about the Constitution, especially women, you say, do they know what's in the Constitution? I guess they do now because they read it. But really, when you think about it, it established a system where the only people who were acknowledged as having a level of humanity and intelligence that would qualify them to be the citizens not only had to be white, not only had to be male, but had to own property. So it's a document that fundamentally was about the interests of the business class. And isn't it interesting that the original Declaration had no Bill of Rights? Why? Because it was a contract among business people. It wasn't about liberty and justice and Jefferson's beautiful flowing words. It's about businessmen coming together and saying, how are we going to protect our empire. We just got control from Britain. Now, how do we exploit the riches that we are creating? And so they created a constitution that we have. The reason for going through all that is that if we want to really appreciate the issues of the injustice system, we need to go back and understand the question of when the injustices began to happen. When this system began to be set up. And so I thought it would be helpful to look at the fact that the Constitution itself was illegal. Some of us would argue that the Constitution was an illegal act designed to give power to a narrow group of American people, and to give them the power to create an army and government to reinforce that power. So ironically, government was created in the centralized form to carry out the Republican perspective of power and money to the rich, right? So it's this whole framework that we're now struggling with in terms of the military-industrial complex. It really grew out of the framing of the Constitution and the government. And the importance is that 11 years, to me, the importance in our thinking is that 11 years after the development of the Constitution, they passed the Naturalization Act, which extended the period of time that was necessary before you could become a citizen from 5 years to 14 years. Why? Because this is 1796. Why? Because the French were coming over here. Where? Out of a revolutionary situation. The Irish were coming over here out of a revolutionary situation. And they were explicitly concerned about having the capabilities to either frighten and drive the French and the Irish back, or to give themselves the power to remove them. And so there was the Alien Enemies Expulsion Act that said, that said they could expel them in peacetime. There was the Alien Expulsion Act that said they could expel them in wartime. There was an Alien Expulsion Act that said they expel them in peacetime. And essentially, they began to set up a system of control so that they could have the governmental power to, in fact, protect this system. And you can read through the history of the early 1800s and see how these powers and perspectives grew. But when you come up to the 1900s, and look at the Justice Department, that had a bureau called the Bureau of Investigation in it, that Hoover initially began to work with in 1920, when that bureau began to look at the Red Scare, and began to target people, organizations, to attack because of their view that the responsibility of the Justice Department was to serve as a defense department internally. Understand? That is, that when you look at it and you look at the power that they gave to this body to essentially ferret out and target socialists and communists who might be a danger, they had a defense department, they had a war department. They had a war department at that time, and then they just established an internal defense department within the Justice Department. And so the Hoover's job was to come in, and with this Attorney General Palmer, under Woodrow Wilson, right? I think it was Woodrow Wilson, so it wasn't under the Republicans. It was done, I think, in the Wilson administration. But then Wilson left and Coolidge came in, and Hoover never went anywhere except up. He became director of the Bureau and continued to use it as a vehicle to focus on whoever they thought were subversives. You know, so what it meant was that this country in the early 1900s created not a secret police, but a national police. They created a national police whose objective was to ferret out the crime, those who were engaging in crime. And while the historical image that we have is around Eliot Ness and fighting the mobs, the reality is that they were fighting anybody who thought that there was a better way to have a democracy. Right? So it was an internal police force, an internal army of lawyers conceived and designed to protect the American system of governance. That is, whenever there were talk about change, then they targeted those who were talking about change. Why? Because and it makes sense. You know, if you have an oligarchy pretending to be a democracy, then the contradictions are always going to be coming up. And during the early 1920s, not only did you have the issues of immigration and the socialists, quote unquote, who were coming over here with it, but they were bringing the ideas of unionization of industrial processes and linking with the workers here who had been dealing with the issues of how do they begin to get a fair share in a country where the basic law gives no economic rights, in a democracy where our basic constitution has no framework of economic rights. How do they protect their interests? And so they were struggling around this. Those who were coming in struggled, and so it made sense that the federal government that the oligarchy that controlled the federal government would have a national force that dealt with whomever they felt were threatening in whatever ways their base of power. And I thought it was important to go through that because there's a tendency to look at the FBI and the work around the civil rights movement, and see it from that context, or a tendency to look at it from the standpoint of the anti-war movement. But the question is, can we begin to appreciate that this national police force that we call the FBI has a purpose and a value to the oligarchy that goes beyond any particular grouping that they're targeting. So maybe they're out in Minneapolis 2 or 3 weeks ago, arresting or serving warrants to come to a grand jury that is controlled by the U.S. prosecutor that has a lot of control over the FBI and those units. So the FBI serves the subpoenas to say, go before the grand jury, which is essentially the same person who is directing our efforts. And they're saying we aren't going to go because we know it's a setup. But that's the same FBI that in another part of the country will be targeting black officials, or another part of the country targeting Latino officials, or in another part of the country targeting some other groups. Certainly the issue of Muslims throughout the country. And the law and the Congress passing the laws that now say if you even speak out in support, you can be arrested, right? New laws that give them new powers. The Patriot Act has been somewhat dismantled, but now the prosecutors have been given new laws that they can use to say to the FBI, do this, that, and the other, and we'll come in and we'll put these people in jail for 15 years who haven't done anything that stood up and talked about the fact that there was an injustice going on. Let me, since it's 12, getting on to 12:15, let me...
12:09.
Getting on to 12:15. let me kind of fast forward and not focus so much on my trial, and then get into questions and issues you might have on that. But as a person who is has grown up as with a belief that when you confront any problem, the responsibility is to look at how do you deal with that problem in the kind of short range and the narrow situation that came up, but how do you think about how that problem relates to the larger community, whether the larger community is a state or a city or the country. And so, as I've gone through this, and just you get over the shock of it, and you recognize that you've been targeted, and see how they're trying to take you down. The question is how to fight back. And if you want to talk about that later, and talk about just some of my strategic thinking about my own personal fight, between the arrest and the conviction or the trial. But the other question is that as I began to realize that while I thought I was fairly sophisticated about injustice in the country, that you can't appreciate how insidious it is, and that relationship between the media and the prosecutors and the FBI that functions, and how it really is psychological warfare, designed to emotionally tear you down. And I began to look at that and think about how it was, the newspapers weren't even talking about the fact that Sullivan initiated this thing shortly after Roe and Gonzalez fired 8 U.S. attorneys in the Bush department because they wouldn't undertake political prosecutions. And here Sullivan got a promotion. That is, he was given, in addition to his job as U.S. attorney, he was given the position of director of AT&F, which is really interesting because people said he was a lousy prosecutor. So given the fact that here's a person who was a lousy prosecutor gets a promotion, and you have to say, you have to, in all humility, say, well, look at this sting operation. You think this was totally independent of the larger perspective? But that's a whole other question that we need to look at. But the reality is that what Dianne and I are going through, black officials, other elected officials throughout the country have been going through. And the the Bush administration was not just targeting, saying to the U.S. attorneys, go after black elected officials. They were going after any elected officials that they felt were going and getting in their way. Look at the case of Governor Seligman in Alabama. Everybody should read that. Governor Seligman. They tried to get him one way by setting up his staff, and they couldn't get him that way, and they came back at him a second way, and they couldn't get him that way, and they came back at him a third way, and finally took him down, that had got a conviction. And then the case had been reopened, but now he's just kind of biding his time. But when you think of it, they destroyed his capability of being an effective player in that situation because they have made their attack on him the center of his life. So for me, the question was, seeing this going on, and being in the middle of it, and of one aspect of it myself, and having a sense that they'll probably put me in jail for some time. The U.S. attorney would like to do it for years, but hard to say how long the judge would how long a sentence the judge would impose. But the sense is that my sense is that it's probably going to happen. Nobody wants to wind up in this situation. Just a side note. But if you're going to be in a war, if you're going to consciously say, I'm going to fight a system of thinking that is just inhuman, then you got to figure that the other side is not blind, And what did Douglas say to us? Power concedes nothing without a demand, and And once you demand, they see who they need to target, and they come back at you with the thunder and the lightning, etc. So, if you know, when you appreciate that you're at war, you also need to appreciate that you could very well become a casualty. The fact that I might go to jail is not, from my perspective, it's a issue and something to deal with, but it's just a part of what we have to understand accompanies the struggle, particularly when thousands and thousands and thousands of young and old, black and white and Latino people are going to jail every day because they didn't do anything except not be in the right place at the right time or be the right color or the right gender. You know what I mean? That is that, yes, what they're doing to me is obscene from my perspective and perspective of a lot of supporters, but what they do every day to the people of this country without any regard for their rights and get away with it because we don't talk about it is obscene. And so to kind of come to the conclusion, you know, my sense about how could the activists in Boston use this situation to begin a process of targeting the prosecutorial system, the prosecutorial national police system, the prosecutorial national police system. All the talk about the FBI kind of, creates almost a sense that they're impervious. And so I think we need to begin to describe the system that we're dealing with and begin to look at a strategy for how dealing with the system. And that's a specific thing that I want to suggest and ask you all to consider. And that is that in looking at the pervasiveness, the extension of the system, began to say, how do you really come at it? And began to think about the work that we did in the 60s around research. Remember that corporate research work that used to be done? I've got pamphlets at home that say what books you need to go to and identify the corporations, how you can see who is on the board of directors, how you can make the linkages between the different corporations. Why? Because we realized that if we were going to fight against the corporate control, that we had to have an understanding of how it operated, and then use that understanding to educate people as a way of moving forward, because it's a battle for the minds of people. The battle we are in is a battle for the minds of people because we're a democracy, and if we can, in fact, enable people to see the reality of what we're dealing with and to cut through the lies and the distortion and the crap that is put out here as if it is true. If we can help people begin to think, then we can begin to have some hope of beginning to change the situation. So when you look at the justice system, what does that mean? Well, it means, I think, we have to begin to move beyond just talking about this amorphous FBI. We have to begin to talk about who are the prosecutors. Who are the prosecutors that are, in fact, in charge of these FBI raids? Can we get information in terms of whether those district offices are operating independently, or are they really controlled by the prosecutors? Because if they really are controlled by the prosecutors, then we need to begin to raise, to talk publicly about the prosecutors and to begin to raise issues with the administration of why do you have these men and women conducting a justice system that's clearly unjust. And I think we have a tremendous opportunity, because I think Michael Sullivan can be the poster child for prosecutorial terrorism around the country, particularly because when he resigned as the prosecutor, when he resigned as the U.S. attorney, when Barack won, he resigned and stepped into a partnership with John Ashcroft. Remember Patriot John? Patriot John Ashcroft? When Ashcroft stepped out of government, he formed a national lobbying firm with offices in St. Louis, Dallas, Houston, and Washington, D.C., one of the fastest growing lobbying firms in the country, according to the reports coming out of Washington. They have 10 U.S. attorneys among their principals. They have the former governor of Missouri in the corporation. The woman who was Speaker of the House of Missouri joined the corporation about 2 years ago. And he came up here and picked Sullivan out. And you have to say, that's a fascinating connection, but nobody is exploring it. So let me kind of wrap it up. I mean, there are a lot of things we could talk about, but let's be guided by your questions. I have asked Jericho, and I've asked Kazi Toure to ask Jericho if it would take the lead on establishing a committee to begin to focus on U.S. Attorney Sullivan and the U.S. Attorney FBI office in Boston. It's a fertile area. Why? Because we had Connolly working with Bulger in the 80s, and yes, Connolly went to jail, but there was never any discussion about the other people, not a full discussion about the other FBI agents who were in that office and whether they're there now, what cases they get involved in and testify on. Then you have Sullivan there. Sullivan was such a bad U.S. attorney that the Chief Justice Wolf, who is still Chief Justice, in the year Sullivan resigned in order to take this plumb with Ashcroft, not the year, 2 months before he resigned, January of 2009, he being Judge Wolf, issued a 42-page memorandum to U.S. Attorney Sullivan, where he essentially said, I'm tired of your attorneys lying in my court. I'm tired of your attorneys lying in my court, and and he then documents, what he had observed. One of the attorneys he had already asked to be debarred, and the Board of Bar Overseers haven't done anything about it yet. Another interesting question: why haven't they gotten rid of this prosecutor that the Chief Justice said shouldn't be in the justice system? But essentially, what I'm trying to point out is the Chief Justice of the federal judiciary in Massachusetts, I think, was so incensed at Sullivan and what he had been doing that he issued a public rebuke when he knew he was going to resign. When he knew he was walking out. But why I think that is important to us, it says that there is so much information out here. Nancy Gertner, one of probably the judge that most of us see as the most progressive judge in Massachusetts, said in 2007 publicly that she thought Sullivan was misusing federal resources because he was taking drug cases out of state court and trying them in federal court and taking them full term, not working out plea bargains. And he said, I have a responsibility to the people that I serve to make sure that we take these dealers off the streets for as long as we can. And yet, in my situation, he was instrumental in arranging 7 years probation. 7 years probation for a man who sold 200 grams of cocaine to a person who got 10 years hard time. Let me say that. Wow. He arranged 7 years probation for the partner of Ron Wilburn, who was the agent that they paid $30,000 to take Dianne and I down. His partner was arrested in 2005, about 4 months after the partnership kind of pulled apart, for selling 200 grams of cocaine. The FBI appeared in court in 2006. In 2007, he changed his plea to not guilty. He got to guilty. He got probation, and 2 months later, his partner Ron Wilburn signed the contract with the U.S. Attorney and the FBI. So what I'm saying is that there's so many pieces of information around this case and around Sullivan in general that I think that we can do a real service to ourselves and the rest of the country to use this as an opportunity to see how effective we can be with that kind of strategic approach, where we begin to do the research and then figure out how do we begin to pump the information out there. We have community newspapers, we have other alternative vehicles. How do we